Letitia James, New York's Attorney General, didn't just land headlines this time. She delivered a baby at 35,000 feet. No entourage, no podium, no camera flashes. Just a standard-issue economy seat on United Flight 521 and a pregnant woman gasping for breath 12 rows behind her. If that sentence caught your breath, good. Because this isn't your average campaign stop or courtroom takedown. This is the story of how one of America's most powerful legal figures quietly stepped out of her title and into something far messier, far more human, and perhaps far more revealing than any press release could handle. And depending on who you ask, this wasn't just a medical emergency. It might have been a test of systems, of people, of what happens when a woman trained to fight corruption on the ground finds herself mid-air, face to face with something no legal training can truly prepare you for. A life that's about to begin under the least forgiving conditions imaginable. Let's rewind. United Flight 521, Texas to New York, was supposed to be just another 3-hour hop across state lines. Letitia James had boarded quietly, dressed in dark slacks, a navy blouse, and no hint of state-level authority in her posture. She was seated mid-cabin, 11F, pressed against the window with a thick briefing folder tucked beneath her arm. The flight manifest would have listed her as civilian solo traveler, and that's exactly how she planned to keep it. This wasn't a public appearance. It was a return trip from a healthcare roundtable that hadn't gone well. Behind the calm of her reading glasses and a stack of dense policy documents was the weight of a failing state Medicaid proposal and an inbox full of headlines she had no interest in seeing replayed on Fox, MSNBC, or anywhere in between. Turbulence was expected. What wasn't expected was the faint, uneven breathing that began about 20 minutes after takeoff, somewhere around row 26. Letitia didn't look up at first. Noise in coach is ambient, background, forgettable. But the second time, when a low moan turned into a short gasp, she paused. Then she heard it again. The strained breathing of a young woman trying to make herself smaller, quieter, invisible. Letitia looked over the top of her folder. A flight attendant had already reached the row. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the attendant asked. The passenger, a young black woman, no older than 30, clutched her belly and smiled weakly. "Just a little cramping?" she said, her voice trembling, breath sharp. The attendant stiffened. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. The kind of tone that tells you someone's not okay but doesn't want to say so out loud. "Are you pregnant?" "Yes," she admitted. 34 weeks. I'm flying alone." That's when the flight attendant's voice changed. Professional, urgent, slightly elevated. "If there's a doctor on board, please press your call button." The cabin stayed silent. Dozens of heads turned. Nobody moved. Letitia lowered her folder. Then she pulled the lanyard from around her neck and slipped it into her bag. No need to advertise state credentials in a moment that didn't require a subpoena. She stood. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just deliberate. Like someone who knew what it meant to step into the center of something inconvenient, unglamorous, and possibly life-altering. "I have some emergency training," she said, reaching the row, speaking calmly to both the attendant and the woman. "May I check her breathing?" That's how it started. No headlines, no politics, just a lawyer with the instincts of someone who had spent her entire life walking into chaos and choosing not to look away. And what came next? That's where things get interesting. Because if you thought Letitia James only held power in a courtroom, you haven't seen what she can do in aisle 26, mid-air, no backup, no authority, just a pair of steady hands and a decision to stay when others hesitated. So, buckle up. The next few hours of this flight are going to challenge a few assumptions about leadership, about strangers, about who we become when the official script falls away. And if you've ever wondered whether public servants still serve when no one's watching, you're about to find out. By the time Letitia James had slipped off her jacket and rolled up her sleeves, the back of United Flight 521 no longer resembled the rear of a commercial aircraft. It had transformed into something eerily close to a makeshift trauma unit with tray tables, polyester blankets, and a growing sense that the in-flight movie had been permanently canceled. As she knelt beside Sarah Thompson, her fingers calm but decisive on the woman's wrist, the tension wasn't just in the contractions. It pulsed through the aisle like static. That was when another woman, clearly unbothered by turbulence or social etiquette, rose from seat 20 with the authority only 40 years of dealing with screaming women in delivery rooms can bring. Alina Vasquez, she announced crisply. OB-GYN, retired but not expired. And just like that, the cabin got its second emergency responder. The two women didn't need introductions. They moved like they'd worked together for years. Dr. Vasquez gave a quick once-over, her hands assessing, her brow furrowing. Contractions every 8 to 10 minutes, palpable tension in the lower abdomen. And she's ruptured. Water broke on the tarmac, apparently. Letitia's eyes flicked towards Sarah, who gave a weak, embarrassed nod. Didn't want to be kicked off the flight, she murmured. And who could blame her? In a country where healthcare costs more than a house, and airlines treat pregnancy like a liability lawsuit in waiting, hiding your labor pains from a gate agent has become its own form of survival strategy. Letitia didn't pause. We need to clear the back. Get blankets, water, gloves, whatever medical kits you have. And I need you to move fast, please. Her voice wasn't panicked, but it cut through the air sharper than the cabin pressure. One could almost hear the neurons of the flight attendants firing. Should we ask who she is? Should we call the pilot? But something in her tone, something in her eyes, overrode the usual corporate hierarchy of fear and deference. They listened. No badge flashing, no grandstanding, just command. And that's when Dr. Vasquez leaned in with the question that probably crossed everyone's mind. I've seen that kind of calm before, she said, her voice low, eyes squinting with suspicion and curiosity. ER nurse? EMT? Letitia offered only a glance and a half smile. I've handled emergencies, she replied. Just in high-pressure environments. It was the kind of answer that meant everything and nothing, depending on who was asking. The kind of answer you give when your credentials aren't printed on a diploma, but carved into political trench warfare, state indictments, and the mental Rolodex of people who can't stand you on principle. And while the back of the plane began shifting into triage mode, one had to wonder, where was the gate agent now? The one who might have barred Sarah from boarding for looking too pregnant without the proper paperwork, probably sipping ginger ale in first class, blissfully unaware that the very person they might have flagged for removal had become the center of a drama far more compelling than anything shown on seat-back screens. It was poetic in a way, that in a space designed to make everyone invisible, standardized, strapped in, nameless, the ones expected to stay quiet were now being led by a woman whose entire public career had been defined by refusing to do exactly that. And this was just the warm-up. Because if you thought Letitia James had shown her hand, you clearly haven't seen what happens when politics, Pregnancy and pressurized cabins collide. The question now wasn't if a baby would be born at altitude. It was whether anyone on that flight would ever look at public service or silence the same way again. The moment Sarah's panic broke through her breathless muttering, "I'm not ready. I'm not supposed to give birth on a plane. I can't do this. I can't lose my baby up here." You could feel the oxygen thin in the cabin. It wasn't just fear that took the air. It was the unspoken realization shared across rows of strangers. This woman is about to give birth, and none of us know what the hell we're doing. Well, almost none. Letitia James didn't flinch. She crouched beside Sarah, leveled her voice to something softer than the jet engines and steadier than the turbulence, and said the words that had pulled entire legal systems back from collapse. "Look at me. Breathe. You're not alone. We're here." It wasn't a plea. It was a promise, delivered with the clarity of someone who's used to staring down mayors, moguls, and mobs that make far more noise than a terrified mother. And that's when the real turbulence began. Not from outside the plane, but from the passengers. Because even at 35,000 feet, no black woman can do something extraordinary without someone asking, "Is that her?" Row 18, Seat B, an overfed man in a Brooklyn Dodgers cap, leaned across the aisle and whispered to his wife, "Babe, isn't that Letitia James?" His tone suggested he'd just spotted Beyoncé at baggage claim. The whisper grew wings, zipped past snack trays and armrests, until row 15, where a retired history teacher with cataracts squinted long and hard before exclaiming, "Lord in heaven, it is her." That's the Attorney General, and she's, what, delivering a baby? What followed wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite silence. It was something stranger. Reverence? Maybe. Confusion? Definitely. Because in America, we've been trained to expect our elected officials to show up late, leave early, and only take action if a donor's watching. What we don't expect, what we don't even know how to process, is a sitting AG kneeling in coach, holding a stranger's hand and coordinating a birth plan while the rest of us are trying to remember how seatbelts work. One woman, somewhere near the back, asked aloud, "Shouldn't there be a doctor for this?" To which someone else, possibly drunk, possibly divine, replied, "She is the law, honey. That's gotta count for something." But Letitia didn't rise to it, didn't wave, didn't smile for the phones she knew were already recording. She turned to face the row of startled onlookers, some with their mouths still open, and said it plain. "Yes, I'm Letitia James, and right now I'm helping a woman give birth. Titles can wait." In that moment, she stripped power of its ceremony. No robe, no seal, no lectern. Just action. Uncomplicated, unapologetic. And Sarah, who had been caught in a rising storm of pain, protocol, and poorly timed recognition, gripped her hand and whispered, "Thank you. I knew I met the right person." It wasn't a compliment. It was a declaration of faith. In a world that routinely lets women like Sarah fall through every safety net stitched by bureaucrats who smile more than they serve. Now, if this were a movie, this would be the part where swelling music drowns out the cabin noise and everyone suddenly remembers what community feels like. But this wasn't fiction, and no orchestra came with the beverage cart. Just an intercom that still didn't work right, and a cart of Diet Cokes that had become a barricade between row 25 and whatever makeshift delivery zone the flight attendants were clumsily trying to create behind the last row of seats. And yet, amid the mess, something resembling order began to emerge, not from training manuals, but from clarity of purpose. Still, the irony was too rich to ignore. A woman tasked with indicting corruption and protecting state integrity was now halfway through sterilizing an airline blanket with warm water and determination, while the actual systems meant to safeguard public health were 30,000 feet below, silent and distant. Think about it. Sarah couldn't tell the gate agent she was in labor because she'd be denied boarding. The system built to protect her would have stranded her. And now, in the middle of the sky, it was a fellow black woman, wearing no badge and demanding no permission, who said yes where everyone else had said policy. It's fitting, really, that it took a crisis at cruising altitude to make a point the state legislature still hasn't grasped. The measure of public service isn't in the speeches you give when you have the mic, but the decisions you make when no one thinks you're supposed to be there. And Letitia was never supposed to be there. Not on that flight, not in that row, not on her knees beside a woman who'd spent her last trimester dodging paperwork and praying for a smooth landing. But there she was. And somewhere in that charged, hushed cabin, it became clear. This story was no longer just about a woman going into labor. It was about a system that labored and failed and was being upstaged spectacularly by one woman's refusal to watch another be left behind. What happened next would be louder, messier, and far more revealing, because the baby wasn't here yet. But the nation? Oh, it had just been delivered into an uncomfortable, necessary conversation. By now, the cabin had shifted from murmurs to murmured prayers. The air was thick not with turbulence, but with the kind of silent dread that creeps in when people realize something real, something messy and unscripted, is about to unfold within spitting distance of their tray tables. Captain's voice came in through the speaker, calm but clipped. Medical personnel would be waiting on the tarmac, but any sudden drop in altitude could endanger both mother and child. Translation: no emergency landing, no dramatic descent, just a few dozen strangers stuck inside a pressurized tin can now doubling as a maternity ward, all under the unblinking gaze of a very expensive corporate liability department. Letitia James conferred with Dr. Vasquez like two generals mid-battle, except their battlefield was a delta-patterned aisle and their enemy wasn't armed. It was biology. Sarah's contractions were clocking in faster, her breathing shallow, skin pale, body trembling in waves that had nothing to do with altitude. Vasquez, unshakable, glanced up and offered the calmest declaration of impending chaos the cabin had ever heard. She's 5 centimeters. This baby's coming on board. Cue the panic. Shouldn't we land? Snapped one man in business class, as if his frequent flyer status came with obstetric insight. This is premature labor. Isn't that dangerous? Another voice chimed in from the aisle, wielding half a Google search's worth of concern. The irony, of course, was painful. In a country where so many claim to be pro-life until an actual life inconveniences them mid-commute, this was the moment reality interrupted ideology, with contractions. And then came the line that would live in cabin lore for decades. A woman with oversprayed hair and a Chanel scarf looked Letitia square in the face and said, "But you're the Attorney General. You don't have to do this." You could practically hear the Fox News ticker warming up to turn that into a chyron. Letitia didn't blink. "I was a citizen before I was a public official," she said, her tone even, sharp enough to cut through policy paralysis and polyester. And this woman needs someone who won't walk away when things get hard. The silence that followed wasn't just awe. It was shame. The kind of shame that creeps up on people when they realize the person with the title is the only one acting like a human being. that the woman some of them had only seen through political smear campaigns and grainy debate clips was now elbow-deep in responsibility that no poll number or publicist could coach her through. Flight attendants sprang into action, no longer just safety card readers but co-conspirators in a covert birth operation. Blankets were stacked, water bottles lined up like fourth stand-ins. The back 3 rows, once home to leg cramps and overbooked apologies, were transformed into a makeshift maternity suite, separated from the rest of the cabin by nothing but chintzy fabric and collective disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," the flight lead said through the intercom, his voice shaking only slightly, "please remain calm. We are currently supporting a live birth on board. Your cooperation may save lives." And just like that, the flight became a microcosm of American dysfunction and unexpected hope. While some passengers watched from their seats with the guilty stillness of people too paralyzed to help and too privileged to admit it, others began to move. A grandmother offered her shawl. A young man handed over his unopened pack of sanitizing wipes. Small, quiet acts of human decency surfaced, not from any training or mandate, but from seeing someone model what it looked like to show up. Meanwhile, Letitia, no stranger to crisis or spectacle, remained unbothered by the spectacle she'd unintentionally become. This wasn't a press conference. It was purpose. Pure, unscripted, and inconveniently timed. And while critics in suits and studios would later question her decision to intervene, the people on that plane, they saw leadership not in titles, but in action. They saw a black woman refusing to let another black woman suffer alone, not because the cameras were rolling, but because the stakes were. And as the last blanket went up and Sarah's screams began to rise against the dull hum of the engines, it became clear. This wasn't just a birth. It was an indictment, not of one person or policy, but of an entire culture that too often outsources empathy to institutions and then acts surprised when those institutions fumble. Letitia didn't wait for clearance to act. She didn't need a memo or media applause. She just saw a life in crisis and did something radical. She cared. What came next would test every inch of her composure and challenge the very idea of what public service is supposed to look like when stripped of performance. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The baby was on its way, and so was the reckoning. It happened not with fanfare, but with flesh, sweat, and a scream that sliced clean through the tin can quiet of 35,000 feet. Dr. Vasquez, hands steady as if she were still in her prime and not 5 years into retirement, did one final check and turned with the cool certainty of someone who knew what came next would not wait for permission or better conditions. "The baby's crowning," she said, voice flat, calm, almost surgical. And just like that, the plane was no longer a vessel of transportation. It became the front line of human survival, strapped together with recycled oxygen and faith. Letitia leaned in closer, not as a politician, not even as a responder, but as something simpler and harder. A woman who had decided, without preamble or applause, to stay. She pressed her forehead gently to Sarah's and whispered, "You've got no family here, but I'm not going anywhere. You're not just a passenger, you're a mother, and mothers don't do this alone." It wasn't a line, it was a lifeline. Sarah's eyes, bloodshot and wide with pain, locked onto hers with the raw panic of someone trying to hold onto the edge of a cliff with one hand and deliver a future with the other. Then came the scream. One long, defiant primitive cry that seemed to rise not just from the body, but from the history of every woman who's ever been told to wait, to be quiet, to be less. The sound filled the fuselage, drowning out engines and logic, and just as it peaked, a jolt. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence. The cabin shuddered, and in the very moment the aircraft dipped, so did the final push. A wet cry answered Sarah's. Higher, newer, alive. The baby came as if the atmosphere itself had bent to his arrival. Male infant, Vasquez announced like a war medic. Crying well, pulse strong. It wasn't poetry, but in that moment, it was the closest thing to it. All across the cabin, passengers inhaled like lungs hadn't been working properly for 20 minutes. Someone clapped. Another wept. A man in 18C folded his hands in something that may have been prayer or just shock. For once, no one pulled out their phone. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. Letitia, still kneeling, still composed despite knees pressed into cheap airline carpet and hands slick with the mess of birth, took the baby with a reverence that made even hardened cynics sit back. She gently laid the child on Sarah's chest, guiding him into the warmth of the woman who had just screamed him into being. "Gabriel," Sarah whispered, eyes fluttering shut, the name coming out like breath. His name is Gabriel. And here's where the absurdity kicks in. Not of the birth, not of the miracle, but of the contrast. Because while Letitia James, the highest-ranking legal officer in New York State, was elbow-deep in amniotic fluid and moral clarity, somewhere down below, there were policymakers still debating whether maternal health deserved full funding. There were committee chairs clutching pearls over political overreach, while this woman reached across the aisle, literally, to deliver someone else's child into a world still debating her humanity. And then, as if the universe needed to punctuate its own irony, a voice rang out from row 16. "Madam Attorney General," the man called, standing with a shaking hand pressed to the overhead bin for support. "You just did what the entire healthcare system couldn't do in an emergency. You stayed." The cabin fell into a new kind of hush. It wasn't just admiration. It was indictment. Because they all knew, had Sarah declared her labor to a gate agent, she'd have been escorted off. Had she asked for help from an insurance hotline mid-flight, she'd have been told to press one for billing. And yet, here she was, alive, safe, heard, because someone in power chose to act instead of defer. Letitia didn't respond with words. She just nodded, eyes still locked on Sarah and Gabriel, whose cries were now rhythmic, steady. The kind of cry that says, "I'm here." The kind of cry that doesn't care what your copay is or whether you filled out your pre-birth authorizations. It was a sound not of bureaucracy, but of arrival. And so the plane kept flying, not just toward New York, but toward a deeper truth about leadership, that it isn't found in televised hearings or tightly rehearsed talking points, but in the silence that follows someone choosing to stay when walking away would have been easier. Letitia James stayed, and in doing so she delivered not just a baby, but a brutal, beautiful reminder of what it actually means to serve. What came next wasn't a debrief, it was a reckoning. And the rest of that flight? Let's just say it wasn't turbulence people remembered. It was what the country saw when its institutions stepped aside, and a woman stepped forward. As the cabin exhaled and the cries of newborn Gabriel softened into the quiet thrum of flight, something far stranger than turbulence began sweeping through United Flight 521. Civility. Not the manufactured kind peddled in campaign ads or congressional hearings, but the real, unscripted, deeply inconvenient version. The kind that emerges only when people are stripped of distractions, decorum, and the illusion that someone else will step up. It started in small waves. A man in row 14 removed his cashmere scarf and handed it over. "It's clean," he said, like it was a peace offering rather than a fashion choice. A grandmother passed forward her travel-size medical kit with the solemnity of a field nurse. "I packed it after my hip surgery," she muttered, "but I guess that wasn't the emergency." And then came the woman in 19C, retired nurse, church volunteer, professional organizer of other people's chaos, who rose without fanfare and offered, "I can help swaddle." I've done this before. No one asked their political affiliation. No one cared what kind of bumper sticker they had slapped on their Subaru or what podcast they binged for moral validation. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the plane became what no congressional committee has managed in decades, a functioning coalition. And then, through the fold in the makeshift curtain, a small hand reached through. A girl, 7, maybe 8, peered in wide-eyed. She looked up at her mother and asked with disarming clarity, "Is she a doctor?" The mother, voice low but firm, replied, "No, sweetheart." She's someone who stood on the right side. No campaign slogan ever hit as hard. Meanwhile, the flight attendants, having graduated from drink service to moral logistics, began handing out cups of water like communion. Then, in a moment so jarringly earnest it could have been scripted by Aaron Sorkin's intern, the lead attendant clicked on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice shaking slightly, "we'll be handing out paper and pens for anyone who wants to share what they've seen today. You're not just passengers anymore. You're witnesses." And that's when Letitia emerged, hands freshly scrubbed, hair pinned back with the clinical precision of a woman who knows better than to be caught in a selfie mid-bloodstain. She stepped beyond the curtain. No red carpet, no photo op, no podium. Just a woman whose knees had imprinted into the cabin floor and whose resolve had reordered the pecking order of the plane. The entire cabin stood. Not the mechanical rise we're used to at graduations or hearings. This was uncoordinated, unrehearsed, and, perhaps most shockingly, unprompted. She didn't wave. She didn't smile like a senator. She bowed, just slightly, enough to acknowledge that this wasn't her stage, and these weren't her voters. This was something older, rawer, a sacred pause for someone who had simply done what needed to be done, and done it without waiting for backup. Dr. Vasquez approached her quietly. The doctor, who had already demonstrated a level of competence that most hospital boards would kill to clone, leaned in and said with a touch of awe, "I once received a medal for saving a baby in 1992. Complicated delivery. Twin breech. Media circus." She paused, eyes sharp. "But today I realized I was the student, and you were the standard." Letitia didn't blink. Her voice came low, grounded, with the weight of a truth too often drowned out by political noise. "No one trains to be a hero," she said. "We just don't walk away when justice calls our name." And there it was, an entire political philosophy distilled into a single sentence. No need for televised debates or a viral Twitter thread. Just one line, delivered with the kind of moral clarity that makes professional spin doctors nauseous. Because the truth was simple. No amount of lobbying, legislation, or campaign funding could have manufactured what Letitia had done on that plane. She didn't pass the buck. She didn't request jurisdiction. She didn't check polling data before placing her hands in service. She answered, not because she was appointed, but because she was human. And perhaps that's what made it so unbearable for some, that the woman whose name they dragged through headlines and partisan panels was now undeniably the one who stayed. So the question wasn't whether Letitia James was fit for public office. The question, now painfully visible to everyone on board, was whether public office was still fit for people like her. And as passengers scribbled notes, exchanged names, and quietly reshaped their understanding of leadership, the flight didn't just continue toward New York. It moved into a new airspace entirely, one where dignity outranked decorum, where service wasn't performance, and where every seat on that plane had become a front-row witness to something that no campaign strategist could have manufactured. But this story wasn't done yet. Because if you thought the delivery was the climax, wait until you see what happened when the wheels touched down, when the media caught wind, and when the country was forced to reckon with a truth far heavier than any suitcase in the overhead bin. As Flight 521 began its final descent into JFK, the engines eased into a lower hum, but no one's heart rate followed suit. For once, it wasn't the landing that made passengers grip their armrests. It was the quiet after the storm. A baby had been born. A state official had done what entire cabinets of appointed health czars might hesitate to do without clearance, legal waiver, and a press team. And now, as New York came into view beneath a pale blue dusk, the woman responsible for the most extraordinary in-flight event in recent airline history was calmly sitting beside a mother and her newborn, not saying a word. The captain, voice slightly more emotional than the FAA manual allows, came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, emergency personnel will be waiting at the gate. We thank you for your cooperation during this unusual flight." His pause was everything. It wasn't a press conference. It was the spoken equivalent of a respectful hat tip. Down below, on the tarmac, emergency crews were already assembled. Stretcher prepped, NICU team ready, and an ambulance door swung open as if the runway itself understood it was about to receive something more delicate than luggage. Letitia James didn't blink. She didn't fish out her phone to call a communications director or draft a pre-landing tweet. She didn't even glance at the rows of passengers now whispering her name like a chant wrapped in reverence. She stayed at Sarah's side, her hand resting on the young mother's shoulder, her body angled to shield baby Gabriel from the curious lens of a world always too quick to turn people into headlines. When a flight attendant leaned down and asked if she'd like to step out first to avoid the crowd, Letitia simply shook her head. Number they go first. She hadn't forgotten where she came from, or why the moment mattered more than the media's thirst for it. When another crew member asked if United Airlines could use her name in their internal newsletter, she said plainly, "Only if the mother consents." She's the one who risked everything. It wasn't media training. It was muscle memory, the instinct of a woman who'd spent years investigating people who cared more about visibility than substance. When the wheels finally kissed the runway, the plane seemed to exhale along with its passengers. No turbulence, no drama. Just the soft, almost sacred weight of landing a new life and a collective conscience. Applause broke out, but not the robotic kind that usually accompanies a safe touchdown. This was different. It was slow, earnest, a reverent beat from people who had witnessed something so elemental, so human, it eclipsed the cynicism we all carry into public spaces. And then, something you don't often see on a plane happened. People lined up, not to race off not to elbow toward the overhead bins, but to clear a path, like parishioners parting for a processional. The stretcher came through first, flanked by paramedics who looked more stunned than urgent. Sarah was wheeled down the aisle, baby Gabriel in her arms, while passengers nodded, whispered blessings. Some even wept. Letitia followed, still composed, still quiet, still refusing to occupy center stage even as the moment clung to her like gravity. That's when a voice from the back cut through. A man, gray-haired and wearing a faded Mets cap, leaned into the aisle and called out, not loudly, but with the clarity of a man who'd been holding it in for 3 hours. "She doesn't need a camera crew," he said. "She needs this country to start treating people the way she did today." It wasn't a soundbite. It was an indictment of a culture so enamored with optics it forgot how to recognize service without a Chiron. And really, what better mirror could there be? Here was a black woman, a sitting attorney general, choosing not to give a soundbite, not to seek a podium, not to monetize the moment. While half the political class couldn't sneeze without selling branded tissues, Letitia James had just helped deliver a human life and was now walking off the plane with zero desire to convert it into clout. Let that sit with you for a moment. A baby was born at 35,000 feet, and the woman who made it possible walked away without hashtags, without handlers, and without even so much as a press release. In today's political economy, that isn't just humility, it's rebellion, because it tells the truth no spin cycle wants to admit. Integrity doesn't need lighting. But don't worry, America was already warming up its outrage machine. And what happened next? Well, it involved headlines, backlash, a few gloriously awkward cable segments, and one very reluctant public figure who would have to decide whether staying quiet was still an option once the noise found her anyway. Because while Letitia James may have landed in silence, the country she served was just starting to scream. The press conference wasn't held in a grand rotunda or against a backdrop of state flags flapping in righteous choreography. There was no podium embossed with seals, no carefully arranged team of advisors pretending not to look at the cameras. Letitia James stood alone. No makeup retouch, no publicist whispering pre-approved talking points. Just a plain gray coat over a dark blouse and a face that looked like it had spent the night not resting, but remembering. The room was packed wall to wall, half full of journalists clutching their phones like crucifixes, the other half of cynics praying she'd say something they could spin by lunchtime. She didn't flinch. "I've spent a good part of my career investigating abuse of power," she began, calm as you like. "But yesterday I was reminded that the highest form of power is the ability to keep someone alive when everything around them says they shouldn't make it." No one exhaled. She wasn't speaking like a politician trying to reset a narrative. She was speaking like a human who had just seen how much paperwork couldn't save someone at 35,000 feet. "Yes," she continued, "I helped deliver a child on United Flight 521, not because I'm the Attorney General, but because I'm a black woman who has seen too many people left behind simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." And there it was, the line that snapped every headline editor in the room awake. Not because it was controversial, but because it was uncomfortably true. There were aides from other offices frantically texting damage control, wondering how to spin this from unexpected heroism into grandstanding stunt. But Letitia gave them nothing. She didn't sell it. She didn't dramatize it. She told the truth in a tone that made the truth feel heavier than any scandal. Then came the question everyone had been waiting for. posed by a man in a red tie who looked like he'd been born to interrupt women on live television. "Miss James," he asked, voice polished in condescension, "would you say this act was political?" The emphasis on the last word lingered like the smirk he couldn't quite hide. Letitia didn't blink. "No," she said. Then, stepping forward slightly, she added, "Politics is what happens when people argue over abstract problems from behind desks." This was a choice between acting or pretending it wasn't happening. I chose not to look away. It was the kind of reply that didn't just end a question, it dismembered it. Politely, precisely, and with enough moral torque to make every smug face in the back row suddenly remember they, too, had mothers. It wasn't just a refusal to play the game. It was a refusal to let the game define what courage looks like. And as the quote ricocheted across social media within minutes, the takes started pouring in. Some praised her as the embodiment of real leadership. Others tried pitifully to accuse her of performative activism, an impressive feat, considering she'd refused every interview offer and declined every network's request to recreate the moment for the cameras. On Fox, one panelist muttered something about activism at altitude before being fact-checked live by a nurse who had actually been on the flight. Letitia didn't respond to any of it. She didn't retweet the praise. She didn't quote the criticism. Because for once, the moment wasn't about digital approval ratings. It was about something that didn't need to be voted on: decency. In an era when some public officials can't walk past a mic without issuing a full press kit, here was a woman who'd done something heroic, then walked away from the spotlight like it was radioactive. But the twist? The public wasn't done. In fact, it was just warming up. Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. She delivered. Egg off the people. Flight 521. And for once, they weren't fueled by outrage, but by rare, unmanufactured gratitude. Posts came in from labor nurses, black mothers, airline workers, and exhausted frontline responders, each echoing the same sentiment. That's what leadership looks like when no one's looking. The story wasn't just about a birth. It was about a rebuke of every hollow gesture dressed as outreach, every official who clocks out at 5 and calls it service, every system that insists on protocol over people. Letitia James had, in the space of 3 hours and without a single staffer present, done more for the public's belief in civic responsibility than most political careers manage in a decade. And now, with the country watching, debating, reacting, she had a choice: to let the moment pass into the archives of one-off anomalies, or to use it as the beginning of a much louder, much harder conversation. One that wouldn't end on a runway. One that would ask America if it really wanted more people like her in power, or if it was more comfortable applauding them only when they acted like they weren't. The next mic drop was hers, and this time she wouldn't be standing alone. The headline was a symphony of contradiction in 6 words flat. Birth at 35,000 feet, when a nation witnessed kindness. It ran above the fold in the Washington Post, scrolled across CNN in solemn white caps, and, perhaps most ironically, sat wedged between 2 segments on political dysfunction and airport brawls. But for once, the story in the middle wasn't about failure. It was about the fluke of dignity in a country increasingly addicted to collapse. The viral clip that lit the fuse came from a teenage passenger with a cracked phone screen and shaky hands, capturing Letitia James cradling baby Gabriel as if the infant wasn't just a child, but a verdict. That decency, though rare, could still be delivered. No soundtrack, no filters, just a grainy close-up of a woman, a baby, and a cabin full of strangers suddenly made sacred by shared witness. Within 48 hours, the video had racked up millions of views, trending across platforms typically reserved for celebrity meltdowns or gory scandals. Comment sections, those normally fetid swamps of cynicism and unmedicated rage, became temples of gratitude. "I didn't vote for her," one man wrote, "but today I'd follow her through fire." Another user, with a profile photo of an American flag and an NRA logo, added, "Finally, someone who didn't make it about themselves." Respect. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a black woman doing the literal work of delivering life managed to bring ideological opposites into rare, if momentary, agreement. But the praise didn't stop with emojis and reposts. Dozens of passengers from Flight 521, now bonded by birth like a flying civic congregation, co-authored an open letter to the president. The language wasn't stiff or ceremonial. It was pleading, grounded, and, in places, furious. "This country needs to recognize that public service isn't defined by what you do in a marble office," it read. "It's what you choose to do when no one would blame you for walking away." They called on the administration to acknowledge Letitia James's actions, not for glory, but for precedent, not for medals, but for memory. "Let this not be an exception," the letter concluded, "but a standard." And then, as if propelled by conscience rather than PR necessity, United Airlines released a public statement that stopped just short of confession. In honor of the leadership and compassion shown by Attorney General Letitia James and the crew of Flight 521, it read, "We are introducing the James Clause, a formal commitment to ensure pregnant women flying alone receive trained support without judgment or delay." The policy itself, emergency childbirth training for staff, revised protocol for pregnant passengers, and an in-cabin response checklist, was less important than the admission behind it, that no existing manual had accounted for what one woman and a plane full of passengers did instinctively. But the most piercing response came not from elected officials or airline executives. It came from Sarah Thompson herself, still resting at Mount Sinai, her face tired but composed in a low-quality hospital video that went viral for all the right reasons. "I never thought I'd say this," she began, "but the woman who delivered my son is the Attorney General of New York." She paused, her voice cracking only once. "And while I was alone on that flight, scared, in pain, and unsure, I now know my son was born in a country that still has hope, because kindness isn't dead. It was sitting in row 21A. It was the kind of statement political consultants couldn't manufacture if they had a year, a budget, and ChatGPT locked in a basement. Because it wasn't rhetoric, it was testimony, the kind of lived truth that slices through sound bites like a scalpel. And while the news cycle would try to digest it into neat 30-second clips, the story refused to be domesticated. It lived in the details too big to be ignored. The retired nurse offering a blanket, the child asking if heroes wore lab coats, the silence that fell when Letitia stepped back from the spotlight. Of course, not everyone cheered. Certain media outlets, perpetually allergic to nuance, tried their best to drag the moment into their usual orbit of fear and disdain. One panelist asked if Letitia James had weaponized empathy for political gain, as though basic humanity now required an FEC disclaimer. Another claimed the James Clause was virtue signaling disguised as policy. These arguments, thin as communion wafers, were drowned out by something louder: actual gratitude. The country hadn't found a savior, it had rediscovered a standard, a reminder that leadership isn't a speech, it's a choice. A choice to kneel when others walk past, to act before the cameras arrive, to leave the door open for decency in a time when every algorithm rewards the opposite. And now, as petitions gained signatures and passengers continued their media rounds, one question remained unanswered. Not about what happened in the sky, but about what would happen next on the ground. Would this moment become another viral memory forgotten by next Tuesday? Or would it become a model, a quiet rebellion against the bureaucracy of indifference? Letitia hadn't said, but the nation, it seemed, was finally listening. 1 month after the chaos, after the applause, after the think pieces and talking heads had moved on to the next viral fire, Letitia James boarded Flight 521 again, this time without headlines chasing her heels. There was no press pool waiting at the gate, no choreographed sound bites or staged emotion. Just her, a calm sense of purpose, and a quiet reunion with the people who had once turned an airplane cabin into a maternity ward. Sarah was there too, holding baby Gabriel, who now wore a onesie that read, "Born in the Clouds," a gift from one of the crew members. The flight attendants who had once shuffled blankets in panic now greeted each other like veterans of a war only they understood. There were no speeches, no champagne, just knowing nods and gentle laughter, like survivors who had already said everything that mattered without words. But Letitia hadn't returned just to remember. She had come back to build. Standing at the front of the now empty aircraft, she announced the launch of the Gabriel Sky Fund, a living tribute, not to her name, but to the moment that demanded more of everyone on board. This fund, she explained, will provide support to single mothers in crisis, fund emergency response training for flight crews nationwide, and offer mental health care to frontline medical staff. There was no donor gala, no high-profile celebrity endorsement. Just a firm belief that policy begins where comfort ends, and the people who are expected to respond when systems fail deserve better than silence. Later that week, she stood again before a different crowd. Not reporters, but residents at a Brooklyn community hall. No teleprompter, just folding chairs, a projector, and the faint smell of cafeteria coffee. "We don't need to wait for disaster to act," she said. "Every day someone somewhere is going into labor, collapsing, or crying out for a hand. If each of us chose just once to stay instead of walk away, America wouldn't need to be made great again. America would already be great because it would be full of people who chose to stay." The room didn't erupt, it settled, a deep silence of agreement, a nodding hush that signals not applause but awakening. And then, like always, Letitia left quietly. No black SUV, no police escort. Just her, alone, stepping into a yellow cab. As it pulled away from the curb, the driver, a middle-aged man with Senegalese eyes and a Yankees hat, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Is it true?" he asked with a grin that was more reverence than curiosity. "That you delivered a baby in the sky?" Letitia didn't answer. She smiled, glanced out the window, and said nothing. Because the answer didn't need to be spoken. It had already landed, in the letters written by passengers, in the training kits shipped to airline crews, in the hospital wing named after a child born at cruising altitude, and in the slow, stubborn understanding growing across a country that maybe greatness wasn't a destination. It was a decision. One made not in Washington, but somewhere over Pennsylvania, when one woman knelt down, took off her badge, and chose to stay